Across time, it seems people have been unexplainably fascinated by bad people. But why? Is it because they're difficult to define? Is it because they elude a common understanding of morality? Why are bad people interesting? Bad people can be found across all different types of stories. It's a hot topic in terms of analyzing media. For good reason. One of the simplest and most effective ways a story about characters like this can be written is to begin an onset of change. Easily the most common and compelling way this is done is by gradually introducing the characters to values they had previously not properly understood. A good example of this can be found in Schitt's Creek. Schitt's Creek is a show that constantly applies pressure to its protagonists, a family of four who once had everything, but as we're shown at the beginning, they've had everything taken from them. With nothing, they're constantly forced to interact with people under a quality of life they would ordinarily see as inferior to themselves. But by the very nature of interacting with these people, their internal principles are constantly proven as incompatible with the life they're forced to live, and eventually it becomes the life they enjoy living. At one point in the series, they're presented with an opportunity to escape their lower-class living conditions, but the plan falls through and they must return to the damaged life they were expecting to leave behind. In my opinion, this is the point in the series where the family's character progression truly begins. Something that the show is known for is the slow and gradual steps taken to introduce the family to these values that are beyond previous consideration for them. There isn't any one single point in the show where you can definitively say that the Roses have become good people. It takes the development of the entire series to understand exactly what the family started out as, and what they eventually end up as. Throughout the early seasons of the show, you were subject to snobby and unacceptable behavior at every interaction. For most, it is that curiosity to witness this gradual conversion that drives you to continue watching. Plenty of people find it difficult to work through this behavior. They have no interest in subjecting themselves to something so negative and would prefer something positive. But once you pull through, the final seasons of the show are of equal narrative importance to the other seasons. Seasons 1 through 4 are the prime meat of what the show is ultimately about, the family's growth and change. But the final couple of seasons are there to showcase the aftermath of these changes. Without that final showcase, what would be the point of watching the development in the first place? Most people have the preconceived notion that the characters eventually become better. But what about when bad people exist and progress throughout a series in a different way? In Schitt's Creek, the characters are essentially subject to a linear transformation from bad to good. In Succession, we witness a different kind of character progression. The show has a vaguely similar type of characters, snobby rich people who are insufferable to watch on screen. But this show tells a very different type of story. Succession is a show that likely has one of the most definitive showcases of bad people I have ever seen. The characters are unbelievably realistic due to the genius written dialogue catalyzed by the great acting. These elements work beautifully in tandem with each other to create a believable atmosphere under which a compelling series of events and interactions take place. Succession is an incredibly strange show. For many, I'm sure the insufferable characters make it unwatchable. But what I think is interesting about the insights we're given into them is that it provides a further understanding of the conflict that drives the narrative. Said conflict is often petty and at times ridiculous, but what makes the conflict so believable is that it reflects its own circumstances. These companies and trades operate at such an absurdly large scale that pettiness is almost satisfying in some strange way. I'm sure many of us would be lying if we said that we didn't find it at least a little bit entertaining to watch real-world drama play out. There's some twisted fun derived from just watching it all go down. Fiction provides us with a way to explore situations beyond what has the potential to happen in the real world, and we can perfect these viewing experiences such that they no longer feel like fiction, especially from a viewer's perspective. Would these characters be fun to hear about if they were real people? Maybe, but certainly not in the same way. They say and do horrible things to each other, constantly arguing over trivial and pedantic matters out of utter self-interest. Anytime something happens to one of the characters that elicits some semblance of emotion for them, they immediately remind you why they don't deserve your sympathy. For some people, it would be easy to develop a genuine distaste for the characters. In Schitt's Creek, you don't have enough time to develop a similar distaste, because it's rather the characters who develop and become good before you have a chance to really dislike them. Characters like the ones in Succession take a certain type of strength to enjoy watching. People tend to dislike characters that are written to be unlikable, but it's important to understand and appreciate that and to find the entertainment in them. Still, Succession wouldn't be nearly as good without the compelling premise. In order to draw you in and substantiate the severity of major plot points, the show must first introduce you to the fragility of the assets conflict typically arises over. In the first episode, we see Logan have a stroke. This serves the narrative purpose of showing us that he isn't going to be around to manage the company forever, and that eventually one of his kids will have to take over for him. And whoever that may be is what the series ultimately revolves around. A job such as managing a company isn't necessarily easy, but each of the potential successors all have the skills and knowledge required to do so. Sometimes a position is held not by privilege, but rather by the tenure of genius. A character like Dr. House exists somewhere between genuine motivation and pure bitterness. There are lots of words you could use to describe House. His chronic leg pain and opioid addiction could allow you to define him as a metaphor for the intermittency of pain and the constant desire to escape it. For House, both are constant, which causes pleasure to become an afterthought. He often talks about how his pain is what makes him who he is, but never does he definitively claim that justifies it. He may be in pain, but he finds an unusual sense of comfort in that. The obsessive, unethical, and often illegal methodology in his practice is something you would expect him to be held accountable for, but his brilliant and unique tendency to constantly make the right call is what keeps his position. It's not just because he has tenure. People tend to use smart as a blanket term to describe House, but the interesting thing about him is that he's not smart because he makes good assumptions, he makes good assumptions because he's smart. He's often described as being alone, and at first this seems inaccurate. You could point to his best friend Wilson, for example, but House alienates Wilson by mistreating him to the extent of absurdity, though it's very intentional. House likes to see how far he can push people before they react. It's only in one-off instances of antagonistic behavior that House solely wants to instigate a fleeting moment of anger, but even in moments like these, it's usually done as a tactic of manipulation. He won't let anything stop him from getting what he wants, but it's not always out of pure selfishness. He mostly acts in the interest of his patients, but if you asked him, he'd probably tell you it's only because he wants to solve the puzzle. Despite this, it would be inaccurate to say that he doesn't care about the well-being of his patients at all. At the very least, he's motivated by the prospect of helping people. He only primarily seeks the satisfaction of solving the puzzle. House likes to do things his way. Even when a little bit of patience and politeness could easily resolve an issue, that's not the way he likes to operate. In Tritter's story arc where House wrongs a police officer during a medical exam, at first all Tritter wants is for House to apologize, but he's too prideful to concede. From House's position, it's a game of pettiness that transforms into a genuine investigation of House's addiction, and eventually a moral dilemma when Tritter interferes with his colleagues' lives by freezing their bank accounts during the investigation. But at that point, House was already in too deep. It was now a game of who can take it the farthest. It seems like House could have prevented all of this by simply apologizing at the start of it, but perhaps he knew that wouldn't really be the end of it. He solved the issue just like he would any other, by playing the game, outwitting his opposition. House does things his way, the way he believes is right.
What's so great about you is you always think you're right. What's so frustrating about you is you are right so much of the time.
House begins countless endeavors to prove himself right, but what about a situation where all that is cared about is finding the raw truth? Lie to Me is a show with a very interesting premise. It follows Dr. Cal Lightman, a psychologist who has studied microexpressions, small involuntary muscle movements that denote underlying emotions. Lightman is very skilled at reading these microexpressions, and he primarily uses the ability to discern whether or not people are lying. He can pick up on small and minute differences and changes that relate to certain feelings that allow him to tell whether or not someone believes what they're saying. Other characters in the show are often skeptical of this, but his methods are pretty much completely accurate for many different reasons. The character is based off of Dr. Paul Ekman, a real-life psychologist who has extremely similar lie detecting skills. Throughout the series, Lightman is tasked by many different types of organizations and even individuals. But no matter what kinds of people he's reading, the results are always the same. Emotions are expressed the same by everyone. Likely the most pivotal scene in the show happens in the very first episode, in which Lightman walks out of a building and through public, and he barely gets very far before he notices 3 miscellaneous liars. As he walks past them, their microexpressions are highlighted to him. The lies he notices aren't any of his business, but they still bother him. But the final person lies directly to someone's face, and so he can't help but let them know. What I think is great about this scene is how it paints a picture of the world Lightman has created for himself, and the realistic downsides to his lie detection. We all pick up on small pieces of strangers' conversations we aren't meant to be privy to, but what we can never be privy to is the authenticity. Lightman's insight isn't exactly meant to be thought of as a curse. Even in this instance we're shown, it's no more than a simple yet distinct con, and it gives us an important perspective on Lightman's character. By letting this stranger know that they were lied to, we are given our first big glimpse into Lightman's obsession with truth. In his work, he uses his skills as a means to settle the truth for others, but his obsession persists within his personal relationships. Sometimes being able to lie to your loved ones is important. It may sound like the opposite of trust, but sometimes you have to believe in someone and let something go. It's easy for Lightman to let himself bend and stress the trust between him and those around him just by being able to read lies. Like when he's upset with his daughter and asks rigorous questions while reading her face to find out if she's hiding something. Lightman has to decide for himself at times if damaging his relationships is worth reaching the truth.
You gonna try and have sex with my daughter tonight?
In the scene where he spots liars, he's not bothered by being left in the dark. He's bothered that he knows these people are in the dark. So much so that he ends up telling this person that they had been lied to. If he wants to know the truth, then that's one thing, but he lets that obsession get away from him in a way that directly affects others. Sometimes truth is defined by subjectivity. People may agree upon an idea but perceive it in a different way. For a character that embodies a truth of delusion, look no further than Joseph Seed. In 2018, Ubisoft released the 5th installment of their popular video game series Far Cry, featuring their most dynamic and fascinating story to date. The main story contains one of the most viscerally unexpected twists I've ever seen. The game establishes a religious cult controlled by 4 siblings of the Seed family, with Joseph as the leader who serves to be the primary antagonist in the story. He appears to be completely insane, insisting that the world as we know it is soon coming to an end. The main conflict arises as your allies in law enforcement are kidnapped and tortured by the cult leaders. And for most of the game, your goal is to save them and the resistance and dismantle the cult. You're revered as a hero, the one who will eventually stop Joseph Seed. The whole time, the story appears to be headed in the direction of a good ending, one where you defeat all the bad guys and become the heroic savior of the story. But after you've taken down his family and reduced him to nothing, and just as you're about to arrest him, Joseph's prophecies come true, and in the end, only the 2 of you manage to survive. This ending is completely unexpected, but not because the game convinces you that you'll be able to stop Joseph, but because you manage to convince yourself. No matter how many people you save, the world is cruel and ambivalent to your efforts. The game plays on your own expectations of how the story will end, and at no point do you even consider if maybe Joseph is right after all. It's unclear whether or not he's correct in his religious beliefs, but either way, that doesn't really matter. His beliefs paint him as an extremist, and because of that you make the assumption that he's just completely crazy and delusional, which leads you to disregard his predictions. Joseph is constantly made out to be the villain of the story, but perhaps he could be thought of as the hero. Ultimately, Joseph's internal principles are all morally congenial, and at the end of the day, despite his relentless cruelty toward those he views as sinners, his ultimate goals involve saving everyone from the apocalypse. Even after all you've done to him, Joseph still wants to save you. He wants you to be part of the new world. There are 2 other endings to the game, but the one I've been talking about is by far the most complicated and is also widely regarded as the only true ending. One of the other endings involves preventing the events of the entire game from happening, and the other one is inconclusive to the story. After the true ending, you feel a profound sense of understanding. It leads you to ask yourself, was it all your fault? Is Joseph Seed really bad after all? He may have done awful things to people, but do the ends justify the means? If we want to find an example of a good character, it should have some ambiguity. Benson is very well written. He's easily the most realistic and complicated character on the show. Benson could be thought of as a bit harsh at times, constantly yelling and criticizing Mordecai and Rigby as he singles them out with little patience and a low tolerance for error as a double standard to the hard workers at the park. Viewing the show as a kid, it's easier to sympathize with Mordecai and Rigby, the cool guys who just want to slack off and have fun, versus their strict, short-tempered boss. A kid would see Benson as antagonistic, while an adult would see him as sympathetic. Many people point to this scene as the moment that made them realize this. Benson is pushed to his limit, and it's the first time in the show that he exposes so much emotion and vulnerability. Benson may be hard on Mordecai and Rigby, but at the end of the day, he's a hard-working guy who has to deal with a stressful management position. If you just look at the yelling and rudeness, he doesn't seem that unreasonable. But sometimes he treats Mordecai and Rigby unfairly. For example, in the episode Stick Hockey, Mordecai and Rigby find a stick hockey table and they want to keep it, but Benson wants to throw it out. So he tells them he'll let them keep it if they can complete a ton of extra work. They end up actually completing the work, but it turns out that Benson had already gotten rid of the table. He made the educated but still unfair assumption that they weren't going to do the work. Even after he's confronted, he still acts like he's in the right just because he knows Mordecai and Rigby are slackers. Even after his peers express their unbiased perspectives to underline the fact that he's wrong, he still has the insight that gives him a spiteful outlook. But in the end, he realizes his mistake, even if Mordecai and Rigby make him realize he doesn't regret it. Benson may be mean sometimes, but much of the contempt he displays for Mordecai and Rigby is hollow. Even with his iconic threat, "Do X or you're fired," he doesn't always mean it. He simply can't fire Mordecai and Rigby. What they do bring to the table just barely makes up for the mindless errors they constantly make. And at the end of the day, Benson values their friendship. He may yell and punish Mordecai and Rigby, but it's not just for no reason. A good amount of the time, it's for perfectly valid reason. Their worst failures can be genuinely stressful to watch. And it's important to recognize the intricacy of Benson's character. He's not bad. In fact, I think he does plenty of good. But with certain other characters, neither option is exactly easy to use as a label. It's here that we can explore the realm of morally gray characters. Essentially a character that is neither good nor bad. They follow their own moral code. Perhaps their actions are defined by self-interest. Morally gray characters tend to be the most complex and universally fascinating, since it's so complicated to dissect them. There's nothing particularly wrong with them, but there's nothing not wrong with them either. Their actions may lead to good outcomes, but they may also lead to bad outcomes. Characters like this are often thought-provoking, but it's rare that we can find a character that's able to change your understanding of morality. Dexter Morgan is a fascinating character study. His general lack of empathy is manifested as an addiction to murder, which forces him to hide it from his peers. But his urge to kill is also a fundamental aspect of him as a person. He copes with his affliction by utilizing it as a means to rid the world of others just like him by following his father's code. Don't get caught and don't kill innocent people. Although that's the way the code is described, it's more accurate to say that he's required to only kill other killers, not just any criminals. The show causes you to question even your own morals in a way that attempts to justify murder by portraying an eye for an eye philosophy. If somebody kills, does that make it okay to kill them? Arguably, there are worse people in the world than serial killers, and by killing those people instead, perhaps he would still be doing the world a favor. But that would become substantially more complicated. As often as we try to establish objective moral baselines, ultimately, morality is subjective. Dexter claims not to truly care about the people around him, and at first this doesn't seem true. You could make the point that he cares enough to perform acts of heroism, but in moments like these, he's only fronting an illusion of humanity. He doesn't do the right thing because he feels it's right, but rather because he knows it's right. If empathy can be found in Dexter's actions, then it's only defined by the callous nature of rationality. Morality is not something present in Dexter's philosophy. It's rather cold justice that is interchangeable with a typical sense of right and wrong. There's only a minute difference between these faculties under which he decides to indulge in his urge to kill, and that's why Dexter can be described as a good person. In the early seasons, the writers stay true to Dexter's psychopathy. All displays of emotion for those around him can be chalked up to him faking it. But in the later seasons, he becomes capable of feeling normal emotions. This is something that the show is often criticized for. His transformation across the series may be unrealistic, but I don't think that's a fair criticism, since telling an unrealistic story is literally the point of fiction. And yet, Dexter's portrayal is so convincing that it makes sense why the character was originally inspired by a real-life vigilante serial killer. Dexter may be one of the most complicated characters in television. By understanding the negative implications of his killings, he further demonstrates that he genuinely has a good idea of morality. But it's still not easy to label him as a good or bad person. Such is the nature of a morally gray character. They exist to elude categorization, to express how dynamic and complicated human beings are. Dexter plays with your emotions in a way that can only be achieved by exposing you to a raw and brutally realistic mind. At some points in the series, Dexter comes across as prideful about what he does. Anyone would when following such a unique and effective code. But it's important for him not to ride a higher horse than others, because it's only his methods in tandem with the imperfections of the law that make him so effective. Were it not for that counterpart, he may be left with no other options. He exists in a position of proper equilibrium, so perhaps the source of justification for his actions is just as complicated as his character in general. What's unique about Dexter is that these layers of complexity only continue to multiply as we attempt to dissect them. He behaves neutral towards so many of his own actions. Even in his killing, he only focuses on the net positive. What he does requires restraint. There's only one time in the whole series that he kills a completely innocent person. His hard proof misled him, which is unfortunate for him, but it's no more than an unpredictable mistake. Still, it makes him feel conflicted since it reveals an imperfection in the code, the fact that he's capable of going against it. So would it make any real difference if he did again? Ultimately, one mistake on his part isn't an end-all be-all. For what it is, the code remains as Dexter's sole guidance despite any scenarios that serve to challenge it. Dexter may disagree with him on certain things, but his father personifies the code as an intermittent reminder to use good judgment and to properly remain what he is. But what is he? Throughout the series, he constantly refers to himself as a monster, bad. But since his efforts have a net positive on the world, good, Dexter Morgan can be seen as either one. Because of this, his character is often mistaken as one or the other. To say he's completely good would be inaccurate, and to say he's completely bad would be self-righteous. He makes us reflect on ourselves, the parts we'd prefer to keep quiet, but if we made them louder, perhaps it could be beneficial. To arrive at a character such as Dexter means that we've reached a finalization. Each of the examples I've explored thus far flow neatly together under him. In fact, his character is multifaceted enough to exemplify each of those thematics. He has a succinct transformation like the Rose family, yet his darkness remains unchanged like the characters in Succession. This darkness is an affliction that he utilizes to feed an addiction that alienates him like House, and because of this, he discovers mysteries that lead him to dig further for the truth like Lightman. His beliefs elude common sense like Joseph Seed, but his negative downsides don't necessarily make him bad like Benson. When laid out like this, these characters answer many of the questions they pose to themselves. There are lots of different kinds of bad people. Sometimes they're simply frustrating, but sometimes they commit genuine atrocities. Characters that are unlikable aren't actually meant to be disliked, much like how genuinely evil characters aren't meant to be glorified. If you're just watching a show purely for entertainment, you tend to have no patience for characters that act like a jerk. It's simply easier to depreciate a character before you realize a greater understanding of them. I think the ultimate definition of bad person is so confusing because of the nuanced severity of different negative actions. The Rose family being inhospitable is bad, but Dexter killing people is much worse. Realistically, bad is a very blanketed term that can remain unchanged despite being used across vastly different examples. So a bad person is a bad person, but the scaling increases or decreases depending on the level of immorality. Perhaps bad people in fiction are disliked because they remind us of negativity in the reality we sometimes use fiction to escape. But I think if we set our standards a bit lower, then maybe we could see things from a better perspective.